Yeah, I'm here too.
I'm here, but they're saying no. Oh, no, people are saying there might be sound. Okay. It's just
Hi,
as
John.
professional as ever.
Wow.
John loves community. John's people saying they can't hear you. Everyone on YouTube says they can't hear you. And Twitch. Just to pile on. I'll ask Twitter. Hang on.
Well, some people are saying they can hear him on YouTube.
Oh, one person says they can hear you.
But people on a couple people on Twitch saying they can't hear him now.
Nope. That's just a lot of can't hear John.
They say they can hear Dan and Damien. Can people hear me?
Can people hear Steve? Hearing everybody except John.
All right.
Apparently everyone can hear Steve. We should just let Steve
Yeah.
go ahead. Just go ahead, Steve.
Okay, wait, let me try this. I think that has a 7% probability of success. Now we hear John. Okay.
Yay.
Oh my gosh.
Sort it out, John.
All right. Doing OBS
Sorted.
things. Okay. Take 3. John and typing. People do hear the typing. Okay. So first of all, Simon Kropp's got this verify tool. It is a verification tool that works with a bunch of testing frameworks. And one that he pointed out is support for BUnit, which is neat. So BUnit, I had not heard about before. Supports for rendering a Blazor component and verifying the output. So that's
Yeah,
neat.
I think BUnit just went through a rebranding, I think recently. It used to be like the Blazor component test framework or something like that. And I think Egil renamed it to BUnit, which better name, I approve. Sounds good.
Yeah, it's a good name.
Cool. And here's that BUnit as well. So yeah, and I gave the heavy disclaimer before you got on, Damien. I know nothing about testing with Blazor. I think it's a great idea. I hope it goes well for everyone. But there you go.
Oh,
yeah.
That's what you're into? Sounds great. Testing.
Cool.
I should do some of that one day.
Well, if you want to know about BUnit, I think Egil did a whole session at the recent .NET Conf focus on Blazor, where he talked about testing Blazor components, and a lot of it was based on his work on this community project. So definitely go check that out if you want like the full spiel on using BUnit to unit test your components and doing like integration style testing. He's got a lot of great stuff there. Yeah,
while we're at that, I don't know if we talked about this recently, but all the content here, I cleaned up the formatting a bit of that this weekend, and there's all these links to all the shows and all the stuff there. So there you go, slides and all that stuff. So everything's nice out there. Yep. So cool. Let me put these in order so I can be OCD. And let's move on. Jason Bach writing about mocking injected types using Blazor. Supporting And he talks through different scenarios, end-to-end and component-based testing. Some injected types. I was looking this past week at injecting IJS runtime. And I guess, so for testing, you would, again, I have not done this, but if you want to mock out something, the results, say, of a JS runtime call, he's talking through how you would mock that. I don't know. Interesting stuff. Again, this is something, yeah. Steve, you linked to this on Twitter this past week. I thought this was pretty neat. So this is a Blazor signature pad.
Yeah, it's nice, isn't it? So I think, I haven't actually tried it, but seeing from this animated screenshot, it appears to be generating a base 64 representation of the image in real time while you're drawing. So I suppose you can then just do whatever you need to with that image data, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, neat. And yeah, he shows the base 64 down below and all that. So yeah, neat stuff. All right.
Very cool.
Carl Franklin on the road, except at his desk. So this is the Carl Franklin Road Show. So he's been doing, there was one last Thursday, I think. Dan, you and I were both on it.
Yeah, we hopped on, chatted with folks. It was great. Yeah, these were in person. He was traveling around, going city to city and doing these workshops. But of course, with the current situation, that wasn't really possible anymore. So now it's the Blazor desk show, I think he calls it now, where you can just join the live stream and get some nice training on getting started with Blazor.
It's neat. People have been pivoting to these live events. This one was great. It was cool to, there was Q&A going, that's something you don't have at a live event. It's the whole kind of back channel. And it was kind of cool. People were asking random questions and yeah, it was neat to see the Q&A going on and stuff. So, all right, my last link here is Ed Charbonneau's Blazor free ebook. So this just came out, the 16th. This is you fill out a short little form and then you download this book, and it's a beautiful PDF, and it's got ninjas, and it's got tons of code and beautiful design and stuff. So congrats to Ed. And if you're looking for some compelling reading, I can't think of anything better. All right. And as always, we publish all these. I'll send the links out in the show notes and stuff. But for now, I will click
like
randomly. Oh, good. Congrats, Ed. Okay.
You're welcome, Ed. Great job on the book.
And now, hopefully, we're seeing teams. And by the luck of the draw, Damien is huge. Wonderful, wonderful. How is everyone?
Doing well.
Yeah, great.
Safe and healthy.
Very well, thank you.
Well, cool. All right, so I guess let's jump right into it. I heard there's tons of demos. There's slides. There's it's a party. What do you got for us?
Let me pop over here. I'm gonna take the screen. Is that showing up now?
It is.
Yeah.
All right, great. So we thought we were gonna give you another Blazor update. It's Blazor update time. We haven't done one of these in a little while. We're gonna talk about all the things that the Blazor team has been up to recently, and of course the big task for us right now is Blazor WebAssembly. This is the entire focus of the Blazor team currently. We have an upcoming release in May. If you haven't been tracking the Blazor WebAssembly release, this is a release based on .NET Core 3.1. We actually just slipped the Blazor WebAssembly project template into the most recent .NET Core 3.1 SDK preview that came out with the recent Visual Studio 16.6 preview release. So if you're on the Visual Studio preview channel, that came with a preview update to the .NET Core 3.1 SDK, 3.1.300 some preview moniker, and that includes the Blazor WebAssembly template right there in the SDK. And eventually that will GA and will be available for download on the .NET site. For now, you only can get that SDK through Visual Studio, but or I guess you could go to to GitHub onto the .NET Core SDK page. But in the future, that will also be available as just a standard SDK download. So that was pretty exciting. This release of Blazor WebAssembly, just a reminder, this is the first release of Blazor WebAssembly, so it will be a current release, not an LTS release like the rest of .NET Core 3.1. We like to ship things at least a couple times before we bless it with an LTS long-term support lifecycle. So don't expect that for this initial release. All that means is that if you adopt this initial release of Blazor WebAssembly, once .NET 5 comes out, you'll need to upgrade to .NET 5 in a reasonably short period of time. I think there's like a 3-month window, and our goal is to make that as easy for you as possible. The packages for this release are all 3.2, so you may be seeing things about Blazor WebAssembly 3.2. That's the May release. We gave it that version number to distinguish it from the rest of the .NET Core 3.1 bits. It doesn't mean there's a .NET Core 3.2 coming out. It's just trying to distinguish Blazor WebAssembly from the rest of the 3.1 release. After May, Blazor WebAssembly will then move to become part of .NET 5, and it'll be part of the normal release train. I'll have a little more to say about that later. If you're trying out the .NET 5 previews, you won't find Blazor WebAssembly in there yet. That's because we haven't inserted it. We won't be looking to do that until after the May release is done. We just wanted to make sure everyone's attention was on one release. We didn't want to confuse people with having 2 different versions of Blazor WebAssembly floating around. So that will happen after May.
Couple things, Dan, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's go back to the So just worth pointing out that we still are able to do servicing, obviously, of 3.2. So after May, there might be a 3.2.1 and 3.2.2 in order to fix critical issues in Blazor WebAssembly. So just because we page into .NET 5 doesn't mean we won't be servicing 3.2. The other thing that's worth pointing out is that if you are trying to use both .NET 5 previews right now and Blazor WebAssembly previews, it can be a little difficult because of the way templates show up in Visual Studio based on which SDK you install them from. And so I went through this yesterday. I've got the .NET 5 Preview 1 installed. I went to the command line and then ran a command to install a build of the template packages, and then I went to VS and I went to choose Blazor WebAssembly, and it wasn't there because I was in the preview VS, but I was in a preview of VS that was one behind the current. I think I had to update to 16.6 preview 2 from preview 1, but it was showing up in the non-preview version from the preview SDK because I installed it with the .NET 5 preview SDK rather than installing the templates with the 3.1 release SDK, because the preview becomes the default once you install the preview SDK, right? So if you go to the command line, you type .NET, you're on the .NET 5 preview. So the templates get installed into that hive. So there can be a little bit of just making sure you're going from the right place and you've got all the right versions installed and you kind of understand where things are coming from. So.
Yeah, that's great to point out. We have heard some people stumble on that who have been trying out the .NET 5 previews. The templates get installed per SDK version. And so depending also on which SDK you have active on the command line, you may or may not see the Blazor WebAssembly template if you have the .NET 5 SDK active versus the one where you actually installed it on. I have tried out taking the .NET 5 SDK and installing whatever the latest preview of Blazor WebAssembly is into that SDK, and things do work. So that should be a way to set yourself up as well if you want to do that. The SDKs are built to be backwards compatible, so it's okay to use a newer SDK with like older templates like the Blazor WebAssembly templates.
Yeah, that did end up working. The problem was when I first did it, I had my version of Visual Studio Preview wasn't new enough, and it affected those templates showing up in the file new. And then when I updated to the latest Visual Studio Preview, then they suddenly showed up. So
yeah, and I think that was a VS issue, right? That got addressed in that release. Yeah, so if you were on preview 1 of 16.6, there was some weirdness with how templates were showing up. That was just a bug in that VS preview, but that got addressed with 16.2, and so things 16.6 preview 2, so things should be getting better.
And with
cool.
with
Good
VS
tip.
for Mac, also we've got it's 8.6 preview 1 just went out, and it's not quite in that, but I think in preview 2, 8.6 preview 2, which should be out very soon, we'll also get Blazor WebAssembly preview support without Blazor WASM debugging, but like everything else is included.
Yeah, from my understand, the plan for 8.6 VS for Mac is that you'll be able to develop, build, and run Blazor WebAssembly applications. I believe file new project, like being able to create Blazor WebAssembly apps will be supported in the 8.6 release. I think the only piece that's missing there is the debugging support. That involves a bunch more infrastructure on for like script debugging. I think VS for Mac still is laying down the foundations for. But I hear that's planned next after 8.6. That's one of the areas of focus to be delivered. So that'll be great. So on a Mac, you'll be able to get the full VS experience as well with Blazor WebAssembly. All right, so here's what we've been doing for the Blazor WebAssembly release. We've been pushing out previews at a pretty fast clip. We shipped one in January and then February, and just most recently in March. Lots of great stuff coming on the Blazor WebAssembly train. I'll go through the features in just a second, and then we will show them. What's going to be happening in the future? So we'll have another couple preview updates in April. Things are going to start moving faster and faster in April as we get closer to the GA release. So the releases will actually compress a little bit now that we're aligned with the SDK update that's going out with 16.6. So there will be a preview 4, probably mid-April is what we're looking at for that release. Preview 5 will be just like a week later, so it'll be mostly just bug fixes, and then a release candidate at the end of the month. After that, we hope to, if all goes well, we hope to then GA Blazor WebAssembly 3.2 in May. What's in this release? Well, here's all the stuff that's already in Blazor WebAssembly, available in preview. So support for .NET Standard 2.1. We have the standalone and the ASP.NET Core hosted versions of the Blazor WebAssembly template. We support IL trimming using the .NET IL linker so that we can strip down your app and make it nice and small. We have support for WebSockets now, which enabled support for the .NET SignalR client. So you can just write .NET code end-to-end when you're dealing with real-time scenarios. We recently integrated with ASP.NET Core's static web assets infrastructure for Blazor WebAssembly. I mean, if you think about Blazor WebAssembly, it is just a bunch of static files. It's like a normal static site that you would write in JavaScript, except done with .NET and C#. So we plug into the same static file infrastructure that ASP.NET Core provides. We just recently added support for authentication using token-based authentication via OpenID Connect. We have integration with Identity Server, or you can use third-party providers, and also Azure AD and Azure AD B2C. Progressive web apps, we added that in a recent preview release. And then just last week, we turned on debugging in Visual Studio for the first time. So you can finally F5 your app, hit breakpoints, and do debugging from within your VS environment. We also have support in Visual Studio Code, and like we mentioned, Visual Studio for Mac is in the works. We've also been working with the .NET team on a more fleshed out set of extension methods for HTTP client to handle JSON processing using system text JSON. We've had our own little helper library that we've shipped with Blazor WebAssembly for a while that had just a few methods to help you, get and post JSON. But the .NET team has been building, the full deal, a full set of extension methods. We're really excited about that. It of course supports .NET Standard, so if you want to use it outside of Blazor applications, you can do that as well, like from your server or in mobile and desktop apps as well. So that's pretty cool. That just came out last week. Now, we still have a few more things to do during the April timeframe. We have more debugging improvements that we know we need to do. This was just the first release of Blazor WebAssembly debugging. There are, of course, a bunch of rough edges and limitations that we're working through right now. We're hoping to get a bunch of those improved in the previews that are upcoming. We are planning to do Brotli pre-compression. I think Steve might talk a little bit more about this, but this is one of the techniques we're using to try and further reduce the app size. Was there? Yeah, I think he said yeah. And then we, of course, need to enable globalization and localization support. So you can use like regex files to localize your applications. And then we want to enable CDN hosting of your Blazor WebAssembly apps. This one's kind of on the line if we're going to get this one done for May, but we're hoping to, so that at least we have the infrastructure in place that if you want to host your files on a CDN, or that we could post the core framework libraries and runtime on a CDN, that you can then use that from your application. Those are the things that are still in the works that will hopefully wrap up in the April timeframe.
The Brotli pre-compression, does that use the same stuff? There's the compression middleware that has Brotli support?
Yeah,
It
so
does
the
not.
the mid,
No.
the middleware will do pre-compression at runtime. So like as the requests come in, you can say like accept this encoding, like please give me some Brotli if you have it, and then the middleware will take care of not pre-compressing but compressing, like doing response compression at runtime. What Brotli pre-compression is all about is, well, if you do this a little earlier, like let's say you do it as part of your build or as a publish step, you can then crank up the settings on Brotli to make it do compress a lot more. It'll take longer to do the compression step, but you get a much smaller payload. So the idea here is to pre-compress the static assets with Brotli cranked up as high as it can go. That takes a little bit longer, but maybe it's a one-time thing you do as while you're publishing, and then shrinks the app size even further. I think Steve will talk more about this and show more details, but that's the general gist of the idea. All right, so yeah, with that, let's just give it over to Steve, and he will show us what these things are all about. Steve, why don't you take it away?
All right, I will. So let me just start sharing my screen. Tell me when you see that.
Got it.
You see it?
Yep.
All right, great. So where are we going to start? All right, so I'm going to spend the next sort of 30 minutes or so, or however long this takes, because I don't actually have specific timings, so if people want to interrupt me, then they are welcome to do so. Going through 6 of the feature areas that we've recently added in Blazor WebAssembly. So I won't be showing you everything in the whole of Blazor WebAssembly. I think most people on the call have probably seen some of the basics before. So I'm really just going to show you stuff that is pretty new. And the first thing that I'm going to show you is some auth related features, authorization and authentication, so that you can start securing your WebAssembly application. So the first thing to show you with that is that we do have some template support for creating a Blazor WebAssembly app with authentication. So now if you're using Visual Studio, then when you get to this point in the File New wizard, you'll be able to go into Change Authentication, and then you can choose one of these settings. Except at the moment, you can only choose one of them. There is literally only one auth type that we've got support for inside the VS UI. But there are other types that we support as well. The other types that we support you can only do on the command line at the moment. We are working on adding support for them inside VS later. But for now, I'm going to show you what we can do if we use this individual user account setting. This is going to use ASP.NET Core as a backend server which hosts all the user accounts in its built-in identity system. So I could create a new project through this wizard, but to save a bit of time, I've already created a project, and I'm going to switch to that because I've already customized it slightly, and I'll be able to show you a couple of extra things. So let me just start this up initially. When that comes up, you will see that that looks like a normal Blazor WebAssembly application. You may have seen this project template like 1,000 times by now and be kind of bored of demos based on this, but don't worry, I'll show you other things soon. The main thing that's different now is that we've got these links up at the top to register and log in. And we've also got the ability to automatically make people go and log in if they go to certain pages as well. So let's say that I want to log in firstly. That's going to take me off to the ASP.NET Core server-side identity login UI. And you can, of course, customize how that looks and what features it has. It's got a lot of capabilities. You can use it to configure things like external authentication and two-factor auth and things like that. But I'm not going to do that just now. I'm going to log in as a user account that I've registered earlier on. When I do that, it's going to take me back into the WebAssembly application, and now it knows who I am, as you can see. I've also added a bit of code into my main homepage to list all the claims from the user account. I know you probably don't know what most of those mean, but I'll come back to that in a second. Let's just see the code that's doing that. If I go into this index page here, you'll see that I'm using an authorized view, and that is by default going to render this markup only if the user is logged in, because I didn't specify any other conditions. And then I'm simply going to iterate over all the claims that the server is telling me about for this user and display them. So this is what the server is telling the client. It's giving us all this information. Some of it is kind of meaningless to humans. It's all internal protocol stuff. But one of them that is worth noticing is this one here. So I've configured my server to supply a list of roles to the client. That's not something that happens by default because maybe your roles are secret, but if you want to, you can make the server send that information to the client, and then you can do stuff with it on the client if you want to. But when it comes to doing any sort of security decisions, any authorization decisions, the first rule that you always have to remember, of course, is that all real security enforcement happens on the server. Anything that you do inside your client can be bypassed if the user wants, and that's true for all client-side technologies. So you really need to do all your actual enforcement on the server. So let's have a go at that. Let's imagine in this case that this fetch data, this weather forecast data, I want to lock it down a little bit. So let's go and have a look at what the authorization rules are by default, or what I've already put on my weather forecast controller on the server. So this is where that data is coming from. And you'll see that it's got this authorize attribute on it, which by default means people can see this only if they are logged in. But I want to lock this down a little bit more. I'm going to say you can only access this data if you are in the admin role as far as the server is concerned. So let's start that back up now and see what effect that has on the application. So when that comes up, which I'm sure will be soon, did I not do it? Oh, yeah, there we go. Right, so now if I go back there, I am in the admin role currently, so I'm allowed to see this data, and it works as you'd expect. But what if I wasn't in that role? So I'm going to log out now, and I'm going to log in as someone else who is not in the admin role. So I'm going to log in as this other user, Bert, who's not an admin, just a regular civilian. And so you can see that we haven't sent the admin role to the client. And if I go to the fetch data page now, let's see what user experience we get. We get an error message. So that seems like a pretty poor user experience, but let's try and understand what's going on. So if I look in the browser's debug console, we'll see the reason why we're getting this error is that the server has responded with this 403 not authorized response, which is great, okay? Because we want the server to perform its actual security checks there on the server. So it's good and right that the server rejects the request. But it's not so great that we're showing this error message to the user. It would be better to show a slightly more friendly message. So how can we do that? Well, let's see. The code that actually issues this request here inside this fetch data component is down here. And you can see it's doing some stuff where it gets an access token and it adds an authorization header to the request, which is how the server knows whether we're really in this admin role or not. But I don't really want to let the user even see this page at all if they're not in the right role. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an attribute called authorize, which by default means you can get here only if you're logged in. But just in the same way as on the server we can set roles equals admin, I'm also going to set roles equals admin on the client now. And hopefully our server and client will be collaborating now to understand what an individual user can actually do. So now, if I'm on the client and I'm logged in as Bert and I go to fetch data, you'll see instead of an error message, I now get this nice access denied message. Now, you might feel that's still not very friendly. If you want to customize that, then of course you can do so. You can go to wherever that message comes from. In this case, it's here. So you can see you can just put whatever markup you want in there. Okay, so that's good. But you might be thinking at this point, well, given that a user who's not an admin can never see anything on this page, why do we even include this page in the nav menu in the first place? Shouldn't we just remove this option from the UI altogether? And the answer is, yeah, sure, we can absolutely do that. That's actually pretty trivial to do. So I'm going to go to my nav menu here, and I'll find the particular nav link, which is for fetch data there. And I'm going to use the authorize view component yet again. This is a pretty useful component that you keep on using. And again, I'm going to say that you can see this content if you are in the admin role, but only if you're in the admin role. So now if you're not, that simply won't be rendered on the screen to you. So now if I reload and I'm Bert, you'll see I don't get the fetch data link at all anymore. Now, of course, if I'm sneaky, maybe I can guess what the URL is. So maybe I can still go to fetch data even though I'm not in that role, but then I'll get the access denied message. And even if I bypass that on the client, we still know that the server is going to reject the request anyway. So we've provided a good user experience for well-behaved users, and we've still secured things against evil users. So that's pretty much what we want to do. Of course, you're not limited to using roles. You can also use things like policy or whatever other kind of system you want to use for deciding whether a user is allowed to do a given thing. So that hopefully shows you how we can get the server and the client to understand who a user is and what they can do, and to collaborate nicely. And that's great if you're using ASP.NET Core on the back end. But what if you're not? What if you are building a pure WebAssembly application that's got no ASP.NET Core server? Can you do auth in that case? And what does it even mean? Like, what are you authenticating against in that case? Well, the answer is you can. You can authenticate against any sort of third-party auth system you want. And I'm going to show you an example of that right now. So I've got an example application here that does login with Microsoft. And this was extremely trivial to create because I used the project template, which, as I said, you can only get to from the command line at the moment, the project template for doing single organization auth with a third-party auth service. There are various options you can choose. And the only thing that I had to change, literally the only thing that I've changed since creating this project, is putting this GUID in here. So what I did is I went to the Azure portal and I registered an Azure Active Directory tenant. And when I'd done that, it gave me this GUID. And it said, that's your client ID. You can use that if you want applications to be able to log in to this particular Active Directory tenant. So now, I did not want to do that. Right, start again. So I'll start up my application now. And then this time, when I hit login, because it's set up to log in with Microsoft, it's going to display this other UI, and it's going to log me in. And it's all integrated into the OS and the browser, so I didn't even have to enter any passwords. It just knows who I am, and I'm logged in. And now if I wanted to, I could go to my Azure AD tenant, and I could start setting things up for individual users. For example, I could start putting users into groups and giving them different roles or claims, and then that sort of thing would start showing up in my client-side application, and that information would also be embedded in the authentication tokens for when I send them off to make requests to other external APIs. So that hopefully shows you how all this stuff can wire up. So that's that. That's all I'm going to tell you about auth just now. I'm going to move on now to the next feature area, which is progressive web applications, something that people have been waiting for a long time, and people have got a lot of uses for. And I know most people probably know what that is, but just for anyone who isn't completely up to speed on that, a progressive web app is a way of building a web application so that your users can use it either as a web application or as something more like a native app. And when I say more like a native app, I mean it should work offline. They should be able to install it into their operating system, so it's on their start menu or their dock or home screen, whatever kind of device they have. And then it should be fast and responsive in the sense that it always loads instantly, regardless of network conditions. And also you can do things even when the user is not actively using the application in the background, such as receiving push notifications from a backend server. So that's the kind of things that a PWA can do, and we now have support for that in Blazor WebAssembly. So let me show you that. Firstly, how you would get started if you want to. The way we've set this up, as you can probably guess, is yet another project template option. So if you are creating a Blazor WebAssembly application now, then you will see that we've got this lovely progressive web application option down there. And you can choose that, and that will set up something that works offline and has got the ability to be installed. So again, I'm not going to use the project template. I'm going to show you a project that I've already created because it's a little more interesting and it's got some more features in it. So I've made this little application called Currency Converter, and I will show you some code in it, but let me just start running it first, so that you can see what it does. And when that first comes up, you'll see it kind of looks kind of ugly on a screen this size because it's actually designed to work on a mobile device. So I expect it to be rendered on a screen that's shaped a little bit more like this. And it's a simple application. It just lets you convert amounts between different currencies. So let's say, for example, I've got 10 British pounds and I want to know what that is in US dollars or euros or something else, then I can just type that in and it will show up on the screen. Or maybe I've got 1,000 euros. I can see what that is in other currencies. Okay, and you can see it's automatically fetching exchange rate data in the background. It gets that from an online service provided by the European Central Bank, which is really nice and easy to use. And I think this is a useful kind of application. And I would like to have this application installed on my phone and available all the time offline. So let's think about how this works a little bit. Let's go and have a look at some code. So it's a pretty simple and standard Blazor WebAssembly application. I haven't actually got a router in this application because there's only one screen. So I've just put the main part of my application logic directly into this app.razor file. And you can see I've got a little bit of some custom components, such as this data store status display, cool name. That's the thing that tells you when we last fetched the exchange rate data. I've also got this code here, which is going to iterate over all the exchange rates, and it's going to print out the entered value in each of the different currencies. And then below that, I've got the little keypad that slides up so that it's nice and touch friendly when you want to type in numbers. And below that, I've got this update notice, which you haven't seen yet, but we'll get to that in a little bit. And then underneath that, I've got a bunch of different callbacks and event handlers to update the UI when we finish loading data, to respond when the user clicks on one of the currencies and reset all the state, things like that. We've got some event handlers for when you type different keys on the keypad and when you press different special keys, and so on. I've got some logic down here that's going to format the number that you've entered in different currency values, and we're doing that in a culture-sensitive way. I'll talk more about that later. And then finally, I've got a bit of JS interop that makes sure that whatever you tapped on gets scrolled into view if your screen is not big enough to show it. So it's 90-something lines. That's mostly all there is to this application. There are some other files, but this is the biggest one in there, so that's the main bit of complexity that you've seen now. But I want this to work offline. Okay, and I've told you that I've created this using the PWA template. So let's see, does it work offline? We can find out by changing the browser so that it simulates being offline. And when I hit reload, let's see what happens. What happens is we get an error message. So the answer is no, it clearly does not work offline, which is disappointing considering that I've been telling you that PWAs will work offline. So what's going on? Well, what's going on is that with this project template, by default, offline support is not enabled in development mode. It's only enabled when your application is published. And there is a good reason for that. The good reason is that when you're doing an offline first PWA, every time you make a change to that application, the change isn't visible instantly the next time you reload. It gets applied through a background process. I'll show you more about that later. But that would be super annoying in development. If every time you made a change, you couldn't just reload and see it. You'd have to go through an annoying wait for it to update it in the background thing. So that's why we've only enabled the offline in published mode. But I can quite easily show you what this is like when it's published because I've deployed it to this little server here. It's a private server, so if you go to this URL, it won't actually work for you. It's hosted on my local network, but I can get to it from here. And so when I go to this, you'll see my application shows up. Okay, and I'm online right now. And if I change to be offline and I hit reload, then do I get an error message? No, I do not. My application just shows up like before. And it works like before. So it's still able to run all my .NET code in the same way as before. And I've got my fully offline capable application. Okay, so that's great. Now, another thing that we can do with PWAs, besides working offline, is install them into the operating system. And if you're on a desktop, you may notice this little plus button that shows up in the top right, which is prompting me to install the currency converter app. So I'm going to hit the install button, and what you'll see is that now shows up in its own window, and it still works like before, as you'd expect. But the nice thing for the user now is that when they look on their start menu, when the start menu refreshes, let's try again, then you will see the application is installed there, and I can just start it up like any other application from my start menu, and it will appear on the operating system taskbar thing there. And as you know already, it works offline and it always loads instantly. So it behaves very much like a native application. But to show you something slightly more interesting still, I'll show you the user experience when you are on a mobile. So if this works, I am going to make my phone screen show up on the display just now. So let's see if this works. There we go, it does. All right, so I'm on an iPhone here, and I have not got this currency converter application installed yet, but I have got a bookmark so that I can get to the site quickly. So I'm going to go to this same application hosted on the same server as before, and I want to add it to my home screen. So I'm going to press the little share icon at the bottom, and then I'll scroll down and you'll see the add to home screen option. And when I tap that, asks me what I want to call it, and I'll just give it the default name. And so now you can see that I've got the currencies app here on my phone home screen. And when I tap on that, it opens in a nice full screen way. There's no browser Chrome, but it's the same application. It's still running my .NET code, and it's all working correctly. And it will work offline. I can't actually go into flight mode and show you, because if I do that, you won't be able to see the phone. It won't connect to the PC if I do that. But you can just trust me that it does work. Okay, right. So that's how we can make our PWA and get it to show up in a phone and be available offline. But what about deploying updates? What happens when we want to change the application? What's the user experience, or what actually happens? So let's say I'm going to do an update where I add some new features to my application, and the feature I'm going to add is support for some more currencies. You can see at the moment I only support these 4 currencies, but I'm going to uncomment this code, which is the next version of my application, which supports 9 currencies in total, which is very exciting, and I'm sure my users will be delighted. So I want to deploy that now. Remember, I have to do a publish in order to actually see this working in my offline enabled phone application. So I'm going to run .NET publish there, and that will not only publish it locally, but it will also add it to my local web server. So it's deploying it in effect. And when it's finished doing that, which is taking longer than usual, I will be able to open that on my phone, and then we will see what happens. It's much slower than usual today. Okay, finally it's done it. Right, so now I'm going to open it up, and what we see is that initially we're still running the older version of the application, because offline PWAs are not very much like websites. They're more like native mobile apps, in the sense that you don't always just see the latest thing that's been deployed. You see the latest thing that's been installed. So I installed this one that supports 4 currencies, and that's what's available now. But I've also put in a little bit of code to prompt the user to tell them when an update is available. And I could auto-install it if I want to, but just to show you, I can have the user choose when to install it. So I've got this update button, and when I press on update, it will now get the version that has 9 currencies, and now I can start converting stuff with rupees or Swedish krona or whatever else I want. Okay, so that's how you can roll out some updates on your application. Okay, right then. That is, I think, enough for PWAs. Let's move on and see some new features. This next one hasn't actually shipped yet, so this will probably be the first time that any of you will have seen this demoed. What about localization and globalization? What about making your application work really well for people who speak different languages and have different preferences about how stuff should be formatted and parsed? So let's see how my application behaves at the moment. I'm just going to start it back up locally again in my browser. I'll build errors. Oh, yeah. Okay. So actually, I've broken my SDK locally, which is why that happened, but it doesn't matter because I'm just going to show you this from the deployed application. All right, so let's take that update. And right, first thing to notice is, see how the date format is formatted in the British style with date, month, year, and not, for example, the crazy American format, month, date, year. Also notice how the text is written in English, and when I start typing numbers in, they're formatted in an English style with commas and dots like that. Okay, that's what you'd expect if you were on an English language website in the UK. But what if you weren't? What if your browser was in a different language? Well, let's find out what happens now. So I'm going to change my browser language from English United Kingdom to French. Okay, that's what I've just done. I've set that preference there. Of course, that would be the default if my operating system was French. And then I'm going to hit reload, and we'll see what we get. You now see that the text has switched into French. Okay, and notice also that the numbers, when they get displayed, are displayed in a French style with spaces to separate the thousands and a comma. And the other texts have been updated and so on. And similarly, I'm going to set my application into Spanish now. And I'll hit reload yet again. And now I'm seeing the text in Spanish, and the numbers are going to come up in a Spanish style with the dots in between the thousands. Okay, so how on earth does all that work? Well, there are 2 parts to this. The first part, let's talk about globalization. Okay, so that's to do with how we are going to be able to deal with things like formatting and parsing. So how are the date format and the number formats working out in the way that we want? Well, this is a feature that's built into the underlying .NET on WebAssembly runtime, where it will automatically set the thread culture of your application to be whatever matches the current browser language. Now, of course, you can change that if you want to. You can just write some code to change the thread.current culture. But if you don't, then by default, it will match the browser language. And so when you do number formatting using something like, let's go to this, using a format expression like this, numeric with 2 decimal places, that will automatically respect the current culture settings, same when you're doing things like formatting dates. We've also made sure that all of the input components, like the input text and input number and things like that, they all respect the current culture as well. Okay. The other aspect to this is the localization. So getting strings to appear in different languages. How have we done that? Well, the good news is we now support this pretty much by default out of the box. You can just use whatever kind of localization system you want that's based on satellite assemblies, and we'll load the right satellite assemblies. For example, in this case, I've added a reference to Microsoft Extensions Localization, which is the same localization package that you would use with server-side ASP.NET Core. Simply by adding that package, I can use the same localization features. The only other thing that you have to do is inside your DI container, you'll want to call add localization. On this occasion, I've chosen to put my resource files in a subfolder, but you don't have to, and then you don't have to specify that option. Okay, now once you've done that, you can use the iString localizer interface in your UI. For example, this is my data store status display, the thing that says when the data was last updated. And you can see I'm injecting an iString localizer for the data store status display. And now I've got the localizer, I can display whatever text I want. And if I haven't defined a translation that matches the user's culture, then it will just display this text. So I haven't actually got any English resource files. It's just displaying this text by default. But I have defined some resource files for some other languages. For example, here's my resource file for French. And you can see that it maps that string, data updated, to this string in French, which I won't pretend to pronounce. And similarly, I've got a Spanish one right here as well. Now, I've chosen to group my resource data by the different UI components. So you can see I've got one for the keypad and one for data store status display. But it's entirely up to you. You can put everything into one big file if you want to. You can use whatever granularity you like. That file will be selected according to whatever generic type you pass to the iString localizer. Okay, so that is how we are able to translate text very conveniently into different languages. And the runtime is smart enough to only load the satellite assemblies that are applicable to the user's current culture. So if you're using fallback, for example, let's say that you've defined a resource file for Portuguese, but not for Brazilian Portuguese, then if a Brazilian Portuguese user comes along, it will fall back on the Portuguese one. If you've got Brazilian Portuguese, then it would use that one. And if you had got some other one altogether, like French, then since that's not part of the fallback chain, it wouldn't even load that one at all. So it does the most efficient thing it can while still supporting the fallback rules that are standard to .NET. Okay, so that's enough about that. Let's talk now about configuration. This is going to be a quick one. We didn't have any support for external config files in Blazor WebAssembly until very recently. But if you look now, notice that I've got this app settings.json file inside my webroot folder. And if we look in that, you'll see I can do things like define feed URLs and override them in different environments. So I've got a development file here, and I've got a standard one, which would be used in production. And I can set up whatever kind of flags or URLs or connection strings or whatever thing you want, whatever makes sense within your application. And then you can consume that elsewhere in your application. So to show you how this FX data feed gets in, this is my currency data store. This is kind of like my business logic class for the application. And using the dependency injection system, I'm injecting an iConfiguration. And then I can just use the iConfiguration object to get data out of the config file like that. So the point of putting stuff in a config file as opposed to hard coding it is kind of two main reasons. One is it lets you build a single build of your application that you can then deploy to multiple environments and have it behave in different ways with different settings just by defining different settings files. And that's great if you've got, say, DevOps people who want you to give them a single build of the application and then they'll change the configuration however they want. They wouldn't be able to do that if you just hard-coded config straight into the application. The other thing that's that's very commonly useful is simply to have different settings in different environments. It's very common to have different URLs for backend data services in different environments, and this just now works trivially. Again, we've done some work to make it efficient, so at runtime it will only load the config files that are applicable to the actual environment that your application is running in. All right, moving on again. Next
Quick
thing.
question, Steve, before you move on.
Yes.
There was a question in the chat that I was wondering if you could help out with. They were asking about the localization work that you did, that you showed previously. They wanted to know if the satellite assemblies were loaded dynamically in real time when needed, or were they somehow loaded up front? Like, how does the loading of those resources actually happen?
Yeah, good question. All right. So one of the awkward things that we have to deal with is that in .NET, historically and up to the current day, dynamic assembly loading is synchronous. So the runtime, when it sees it needs to load another assembly, it just does it and it just pauses your application until it's done that. That's completely impossible on the web because when we need to fetch stuff over the network, you can't do that synchronously. The browser will not let you do that. So the satellite assemblies do have to be loaded up front, but we've done something to make it quite easy for you. What we've done is, by default, we will synchronously load the satellite assemblies that are relevant to the user's culture before we even call the application entry point. So for most people, that's going to be sufficient. But if you need to do something custom where you change the culture as part of your startup logic, for example, you're going to be looking at something in local storage or a URL or something to decide what culture to use, then when you call, let's find the actual method so I can show you. When you actually start your application using run async, if the culture has been changed by that point, then we will dynamically load whatever new set of satellite assemblies are needed before your application really starts up. So we've hopefully taken away the pain of figuring out how the assembly loading works. If your logic for setting the culture is in your program main, then everything's just going to work in the way you want. So hopefully that answered that question.
As long as it's up front, if people tend to try to have like some sort of UI picker within their application, then that would they would need to then handle that.
Yeah, you would want to reload the page. Yeah, if you're changing the culture dynamically, it doesn't make sense not to reload the page because all kinds of things in .NET will cache the current culture and they won't recognize the fact that you've changed it. So you will want to do a reload.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Okay, right then, debugging. Dan mentioned this before. Of course, this is something that people have been crying out for such a long time. We've had support for debugging inside the browser for a long time, but you had to go through a very complicated process in order to connect to the debugger inside the browser. And people have said, why is it so hard? Why can't I just press the F5 key inside my IDE? Why can't you just make it all light up for me? And the answer to that has always been, well, it's a lot of engineering work to get this stuff to happen. But the great news is we have finally done it. So I'm going to debug my application now, pressing F5 and nothing else. So what am I going to do? Let's say I want to put a breakpoint in my application here when the user selects a currency, okay? And I'm going to press the F5 key just now. I could click the play button if it was on the screen, but it isn't. So I've just pressed the F5 key and it's rebuilt the application and it's now launching a browser for me, and it's going to connect Visual Studio's debugger to the .NET application that's running inside the browser on WebAssembly. So when that loads up, which hopefully will not take long. Oh, of course, did I break the build earlier? Yeah, I did. I broke it earlier, didn't I? Oh, that's super annoying. I might not be able to show you. You might just have to trust me that if I hadn't broken my SDK, then that build would have passed. I don't know. I'm just going to try one thing, actually. I'm going to kill Visual Studio and restart it. That is annoying, though. But it's for a good cause. I was hacking at the SDK earlier in order to fix a publishing issue. So that's why I've done that. Let's see if I can actually get this thing to build and run.
While Steve's hacking this, if people have other questions. Let's see. Does debug work in code behind classes? Yes, it does. So when you're doing Blazor WebAssembly debugging, you can debug any of the C# code, your Razor code, while you're in the debugger. I will say that there are some rough edges. Like it's not there's some gaps between the current experience and the full .NET debugger experience. The way this works is actually kind of interesting. The debugging will actually happen through Visual Studio's script debugging infrastructure. And what we do is we put a debugging proxy that speaks the browser debugging protocol in between Visual Studio and the browser that augments the protocol with .NET specific stuff. So it's actually all happening through like the stuff that you would normally use to do JavaScript debugging, but making it look as if it's doing .NET debugging, which enables a bunch of interesting things. It means you can simultaneously debug your WebAssembly.NET code, your server.NET code, and even JavaScript code that you may be doing JavaScript interop to call into.
Yeah. Okay. Good filling in there, Dan. That was
You're welcome.
So anyway, I made it build. So now I noticed that the breakpoint is a nice solid red blob, which is what you want to see. It means that it's connected. And when I click on a particular currency, you'll see it's hit my breakpoint now. And I can even do some cool things like I can hover over this and go and explore and see what value had just been picked by the user. So I'm not promising that every aspect of debugging works correctly right now, because it does not. But lots of things do work, and we really want feedback as much as possible. Every single detail that you see that isn't right, however minor, please file an issue, because we want to know about the full range of things that you're not satisfied with, so that we can prioritize and get the best experience by the time this goes in May. All right, last thing, app size. Okay, this is going to be quick. So we've been doing a lot of work to try and bring the default size for a Blazor application down. Obviously, it's a challenge for a Blazor WebAssembly as a technology, because we're bringing an entire .NET runtime into the browser. So, you know, if we weren't careful, that could be 100 megabytes or something. It could be terrible. So we've done a lot of work right since the beginning of the project to try and keep the size down. If you go back in time by about a year, then a Blazor WebAssembly app at that time would have been about 2.3, 2.35 megabytes. Now, of course, it's all cached. So I'm only talking about the very first hit for a user who has got a completely clean cache and has never been to your site before. They would have been paying about 2.3 megabytes to download before. Now, we did a bunch of work, and in the Preview 2 release that we shipped about, I don't know, a month or so ago, 6 weeks, I don't know, we'd managed to bring that down to about 1.8, 1.9 megabytes. And we achieved that by making the linker much smarter, so it's able to strip out more code, and also by making some improvements to compression. But we've still got one bullet left in the gun that we are going to use to make things a bit smaller for the May release. So by the time this thing ships in its next Preview 4 release, we expect the default app size to come down to about 1.5 megabytes. And that will be achieved using the very aggressive Brotli pre-compression that Dan mentioned earlier. Now, I can't show you that for real because we haven't actually implemented it yet, but just to prove that this is not just some crazy fantasy that can never be delivered on in the real world, I'm going to actually compress my application with Brotli right now and show you what that would be. So I've made this old school DOS batch file here called something.command, and that is simulating the same thing that we're going to put into the SDK in the next release. So it's going to perform an offline Brotli compression with the best possible compression ratio, which takes a while, and this is why we need to do it as pre-compression, not at runtime. So it will only you will only pay the cost during publishing. You have to wait an extra 10 seconds or something. So that's happened now, and my application should be ready to serve. So I'm going to go to this location now, and I'm going to make it actually load properly. So I'm going to, I've got various service workers and stuff that are interfering with things right now, but I'm going to disable the cache and load that properly. So that's a completely fresh load there without any cached data. And you'll see that the app size is 1.6 megabytes. So you might say, well, that's not what you promised, is it? You said 1.5. Well, the thing is that my application is not an empty application. I've got a bunch of other stuff in, for example, all these flag images and various bits of CSS and stuff, and that's pushed it up to 1.6. But if I really stripped it down to the basics, I could get it to 1.5. And so that's what we expect to be in the default project. All right, so that is it. That's all I've got time for. But I'll hand back to other people and we can talk about any other stuff.
Someone just asked about the decompression cost when you do that. Like when you crank it up to 11 on the compression, what does that then mean for the client?
Yeah, great question. So these kinds of compression technologies that are supported in browsers are very, very strongly optimized for fast decompression speed. So all the cost is incurred during the compression time, not during decompression. So that's what the compressor is doing. It's finding a representation that is both small and extremely cheap to decompress. So you won't notice any difference at all. Or I don't know, maybe if you had like an atomic clock or something, you could notice a difference. But, you know, a normal human being will not tell the difference between uncompressed. In fact, it's probably going to be quicker. Obviously, it'll be quicker in terms of the download time, but it's probably less work on the CPU as well, because the amount of no, I can't justify that claim. Forget that. Let's just say it's the same.
Imperceptibly, slightly different maybe, but like not something that you would even really notice.
Yeah,
that's cool. Great to see. I was just going to wrap up to give people a quick view of what we're doing after the May release, because I know there've been a bunch of questions about this. So like I said, Blazor WebAssembly will move to be part of .NET 5 after May. Like you won't find Blazor WebAssembly bits in any of the .NET 5 previews yet. But once we're done with May, we'll then insert, and you'll start seeing Blazor WebAssembly there as well. These are the main themes that we're looking at for .NET 5 across Blazor, not just for Blazor WebAssembly. We have a bunch of component model improvements that we're planning to do to help build out a really great component ecosystem. So stuff like support for required parameters, iasync disposable, enabling you to restrict parent and child component relationships, stuff like that. A bunch of niceties to make writing components better and more productive. Less JavaScript, more C#. There's a bunch of cases today in Blazor where you have to drop down to JavaScript interrupt to get your scenario done. These are simple things like setting the UI focus or drag and drop, file uploads. We want to make these scenarios out of the box a C# experience as much as possible. So we've got a bunch of little features in that space that we want to do. Many of the questions were about WebAssembly fundamentals. So AOT compilation, that is not in scope for May. We don't expect to have that for May. So the runtime is still the IL interpreter-based runtime, but we are planning to look at that in the .NET 5 timeframe. The expectation there is probably that the first turn of the crank will be that we'll AOT more of the framework libraries for you, like the hot paths. And then maybe post .NET 5, we actually give you the full tool chain so you can decide what you want to AOT. Details still to be worked out. The other WebAssembly fundamentals are support for threading. Browsers have been enabling support for threading, and we actually have some existing implementations internally of threading support on .NET on WebAssembly. Not coming in May, but something we hope to enable broadly in the .NET 5 timeframe. And then there's just a unification work with the .NET 5 effort. Like we want to move the core framework libraries that you use for Blazor WebAssembly to be the same ones that are used by all of .NET 5. That's part of that whole one .NET vision if you've been following the .NET 5 effort. There are a bunch of functionality gaps that we know we want to look at. Hot reload is one of these areas, or at least having a really good fast dev inner loop. We're looking at that space. People were asking about like CSS isolation. There's no out-of-the-box story for CSS isolation in May. We're going to look at it in .NET 5. We don't know if we'll actually be able to deliver something there yet, but it is on our backlog to at least investigate. We know we've heard a lot of feedback about that, as well as lazy loading of different areas. That's also not in scope for May, looking at it in .NET 5. And then, of course, we care about Azure. We want to make sure when you go to deploy your application, you have a really great experience hosting on the cloud. So we're doing a bunch of work to investigate, making sure we have a great story with telemetry and diagnostics, like integration with App Insights. We want to have a really great static site hosting story on Azure, so you can easily publish your Blazor WebAssembly as a static site, and then just making sure all the normal Azure SDK libraries work great with Blazor WebAssembly, whether it's storage or event grid and so forth. So that's looking forward a little bit, some things to look forward to, and with that, I think we're done. John.
Wow. I think we hit a record today, actually. We had, what, 325 people on concurrently? That like rivals what we get at some like big conference virtual conferences. So, and tons of great feedback on the demos and everything. People are quite excited. One question that came up several times is, people are hoping, Steve, that you can publish your samples because
yeah, the currency app, I will definitely publish that. I just need to sort of slightly disentangle it from internal builds of things, but yeah, then I will publish it.
Cool. There's a question on the WebView desktop hosting model, if there's anything new on that. You know, because you're just sitting around not doing anything. We wondered if you were.
Yeah.
Do you want me to take that one, Steve? So
go for it.
I think they're referring to Steve's web window experiment. We talked about that at an earlier stand-up. This was a prototype of trying to do like an electron light. Like, what if you didn't need to bring the whole Chromium shell with your app? And what if you didn't bring Node and you just used .NET Core? Could you make your app smaller, more memory efficient? And Steve put out a really cool proof of concept that showed, actually you could build native desktop apps with Blazor and web UI tech that are, very small to download, particularly if you take advantage of like a framework dependent deployment, and do much better in terms of how much memory they use. There's lots of conversations happening internally right now on the .NET team broadly about what do we think about UI and cross-platform UI in general. Lots of things being discussed. There's lots of interesting experiments out there in addition to web window, like the mobile Blazor bindings for doing like full native UI. Nothing concrete to say or announce yet. Like, we're still experimenting and discussing and planning, but hopefully in the soon we'll have more to say about what we hope to do in terms of product planning in that space.
Cool. Let me see. I had a question. Out of all the stuff you showed, I mean, this was WebAssembly focused. Do any of the things that feature, or which of the features have any kind of impact on server-side Blazor? Like, for instance, localization, or, like out of those server, or so I guess PWA is kind of less applicable because it's not the whole static files, but yeah.
Yeah, so besides PWA, so we had auth. Now that we already have a set of auth-enabled templates for Blazor Server. In fact, we've got even more options there. Localization, globalization, configuration, and debugging, all of those things are just inherent to .NET Core. So when it's running on the server, that all just happens for free. As far as the Blazor team is concerned, we did nothing for any of that. That's there already. And size is not applicable as a similar concept. So basically, the good news is that all the stuff that you want on the server is already there.
Cool. Yeah, servers shipped with .NET Core 3.1. Like, the whole end-to-end experience is already in the box with the .NET Core 3.1 release. Right now, all the work we're doing is just about enabling Blazor WebAssembly functionality and features on top of that 3.1 foundation. .NET 5 is the next opportunity we have to really add functionality and improvements across the stack, including the component model, because the component model ships in .NET Core 3.1. We're using the same component model for Blazor WebAssembly that we used with Blazor Server. It's all in the same foundation.
All right. Gosh, I mean, there have been some questions. A lot's been discussed, but I think you folks have answered a good amount of stuff on this. I haven't seen any other huge, standout questions to ask. Anything discussion-wise that came up in the chat that you want to call out, like questions answered or anything?
I mean, talk to most of the things around .NET 5. So AOT, CSS isolation, lazy loading. I know we know those are hot topics. Those we'll be looking at those at least in .NET 5 timeframe. Those aren't coming in May. It's only so much time in the day. Only so much we can force Steve to code before he breaks. And
it's not just me. Let's be clear. We've got other team members, and they're very talented, and they do a lot of good work.
And it's not even actually only our team. Like, we have the whole .NET runtime team and the tooling folks that aid with all this. But just thank you to all the people that are trying out the Blazor WebAssembly releases. I've been doing my best to keep up with all the comments that get posted on the announcement blog post as people jump on and try out the new bits and tell us when things aren't working. And it's great to get that level of community support so that we can make the product as best as we can make it.
Awesome. Well, great. Damien, anything else?
Nope.
Awesome. Okay.
All right.
Greatest show ever. Dramatic zoom outs and all that. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Yay.
Thanks, John.
All right. Now I awkwardly switch to the thanks screen. And wait. I got to mute.